A man once said, if you want a good story, just ask any random person if there was ever an event in their life they cannot explain. Someone almost always has one weird thing that has happened to them. So Reddit, regardless of whatever you believe about the world, what's your story? I'm an ER doctor currently. When I was in med school we had a chronic respiratory failure patient who was DNR/DNI. During our morning rounds, nurse called us to bedside for vital sign check. Guy was deader than a block of wood. No pulse, no breathing, pupils fixed and dilated, etc. My senior resident was like, this is a great chance for you to confirm your first dead body. We write up his death note, make arrangements, whatever. An hour later, we get called by the same nurse. This guy is alive and talking to me. Sure enough, homeboy is wide awake and chatty Cathy. He got discharged a few days later. I kept tabs on him until I finished med school. He lived at least another 1.5 years. Me and a friend saw a teeny tiny person. This was in the 90s and there was a really nice pub about a mile from where my friend Jason lived, and the walk there from his house took us along one of the canals. This was in England, the West Midlands to be precise. One evening, I'd gone over to his house, we walked over to the pub, had a couple of pints, something to eat, and were on our way back. It wasn't late, early evening and still a decent amount of light. We're walking down the track beside the canal when we hear a splash in the water behind us. Turning around, we see, about 40 feet away, the ripples of something moving through the canal towards the bank. Now both of us were keen bird watchers at the time, so we were guessing it was something like a coot or a moorhen. So we were both pretty fucking shocked when what looked like a tiny little naked ass man, about 8 inches tall, climbed out of the water, shook himself off and dashed into the hedgerow. We were both frozen for a few moments before we headed to the spot where the little man had gotten out of the water. Didn't find any trace of him. We got back to Jason's place and spent a couple of hours trying to rationalize it, but there was no other animal or bird that we could think of that we might mistake for a tiny person. I've posted this before, but my wife used to win radio contests, pretty much whenever she wanted to. She won a lot. Like, really, a lot. She had no particular technique. This was across multiple radio stations in several cities, and I have no explanation. Examples, not all. As a teenager, she bought her back-to-school clothes each year by winning shopping gift cards on the radio. When our daughter was a baby, my wife won a year's supply of diapers, video games, t-shirts, and other items. Years later, she won us dozens of tickets to concerts from KROQ in Los Angeles. We went to the Weenie Roast and Acoustic Christmas, big multiple band concerts, almost every year for years. We saw Boingo's Halloween concert multiple years. We saw Jewel at an in-store appearance, and the morning DJs knew my wife well enough that when Jewel was going to teach someone to yodel, the DJ called my wife's eye to ask silently if she wanted to be the one. She did. My wife flew on a chartered party plane to Vegas to see U2. The ultimate was one time when my brother and his wife were having dinner with us. KROQ was playing in the background and the DJ says caller 106.7 wins tickets to Acoustic Christmas. My wife casually mentions that we can't go, so she hasn't bothered to win tickets. Sister-in-law says, "What do you mean, you haven't bothered to win tickets?" Wife replies, "If we could go, I'd win tickets to go. But we have something else planned and can't go, so I haven't." Sil, "You can't just win tickets, it's Acoustic Christmas." Wife, "Sure I can." Sil, slowly and a bit sarcastically, "Well, we can go, so why don't you win us tickets?" Wife, "Sure, no problem." About an hour later, the very next time, the DJ says caller 106.7 wins tickets to Acoustic Christmas. Wife gets up and casually walks across the room to the phone, picks up, starts dialing. Looks up and says, caller 47. Dials. 73. Dials. 89. Dials. Holds out the phone and says, 106.7. Sil gets up, incredulous, and takes the phone. Next thing we hear over the radio is, caller 106.7, you win. Followed by Sil saying, "What? This is not KROQ." But it was, and my wife won one of the hardest tickets to get in Los Angeles, competing against the rest of the city, on demand, on the very first try. DL, doctor, my wife wins radio call-in contests pretty much whenever she wants to, and I have no explanation. When I was growing up, my dad and I would sit for hours and watch dragonflies. He and my mom divorced when I was 13 and he moved out of state and couldn't really support himself and a kid, So my mom got custody and moved us to a different state. The invitation was always open for him to visit, but he never did. But we'd talk on the phone a few times a week to stay caught up. He'd gotten a rare kind of cancer in his vocal cords and was going to have something surgically removed in there. He called me a few days after the surgery and told me things were looking good, but they were keeping him in the hospital because he had a fever after the surgery. I knew at that point that this was our last conversation. The next day, I was sitting in my truck before work with the window open and a dragonfly landed on my hand. It was November, so there shouldn't have been any around, and it felt like my dad was standing there. About 2 minutes later I got a call from his friend that was staying with him at the hospital that he had passed away about 5 minutes before I'd seen the dragonfly. This is a dark one. It happened when I was around 11. My parents and I went on a trip to Austria and we visited a theme park. In the theme park was a jumpy thing. There was a 1 meter, 2 meters and 3 meters pole and you could jump down on this huge cushion. I wanted to try and went straight up the highest pole. I've jumped down those poles before a few times, but that time I was just terrified. I don't know why, but all out of a sudden I was shaking and scared for my life. It was this deep kind of fear which I never felt before. My mind was telling me not to jump. Which didn't make sense because I just jumped down there and it was fun. So I let the kid behind me go first. She died. The cushion had a leak and she broke her neck. She was 9 years old. I climbed down and will never forget this. If I had jumped, I would be dead, and I can't stop feeling like fate wanted me on that day and not her. Not me, my father. From his perspective. When I was young, probably 12 or 13, my family lived in a small residential suburb. There was a street lamp right across the street from us that would shine into our living room window at night, so every night before we went to bed my father would draw the curtains. One night I woke up around 2 a.m. and went to the kitchen to get some water. As I passed through the living room I noticed a beam of light from the street lamp had made it through a small gap between the curtains and I had the urge to peek through. Standing under the street lamp was a tall man with a black cap, silver skin, and massive eyes, those huge bug eyes that you see in alien movies. He was standing there motionless, and staring right at me. I quickly ducked down behind my father's recliner. There was no way he could have seen me. The house was completely dark and I barely moved the curtains as I looked through. After a few minutes of sitting on the floor behind the recliner, I grew curious to see if the man had passed. I looked through the curtains again. Pressed firmly against the other side of the glass, inches away from my face, was the silver man with bug eyes, staring right at me. After a moment frozen in terror, I ran through the house towards my father's room and woke him up, quickly telling him what happened. He grabbed his shotgun and went outside to look around. He didn't find anyone, but there was a set of fresh footprints in the dew that had been collecting on the lawn. My father has recounted this story to me exactly twice, and even though it happened to him some 40 years ago, I could still see the goosebumps on his arms as he recalled the experience. Weirdest thing I can think of is this. When I was a freshman in high school, I started getting really into like psychics and stuff, and my friend, now my so, took me to this palm reading / tarot card booth at a Renaissance fair. When I sat down in front of her, she greeted me, then looked behind me, then back at me and said, "You have 4 people behind you." I went into her tent alone. I don't remember much of the reading, just that she mentioned African violets, because one of the spirits behind me had some connection to them. I didn't really think much of it because I didn't know anybody, dead or alive, who liked African violets, and I forgot about it until the following year. The next year, I went to the same booth, with a different lady. My so sat with me. She asked me if I knew anything about African violets, completely unprovoked. I said no. She said I should get them, for the spirit behind me. I left the reading feeling really weird, but again I kind of shrugged it off. 6 months later, I was at a Home Depot with my dad. I separated from my dad to look at the flowers and came across some African violets. I bought them, put them in a new pot, and set them on my windowsill when I got home. 2 minutes later, my mom comes in and asks me if I got anything from the store. African violets, I told her. My mom smiled and sighed, then looked at me and said, "You know, those were your grandmother's favorite flowers." My grandmother died 9 years ago, when I was 11. And when I went back to that booth the following year, they didn't even mention African violets. I know it's not a creepy story or anything, but it still kinda weirds me out. Years later, she won us dozens of tickets to concerts from KROQ in Los Angeles. We went to the Weenie Roast and Acoustic Christmas, big multiple band concerts, almost every year for years. We saw Boingo's Halloween concert multiple years. We saw Jewel at an in-store appearance. and the morning DJs knew my wife well enough that when Jewel was going to teach someone to yodel, the DJ called my wife's eye to ask silently if she wanted to be the one. She did. My wife flew on a chartered party plane to Vegas to see U2. The ultimate was one time when my brother and his wife were having dinner with us. KROQ was playing in the background and the DJ says caller 106.7 wins tickets to Acoustic Christmas. My wife casually mentions that we can't go, so she hasn't bothered to win tickets. Sister-in-law says, "What do you mean, you haven't bothered to win tickets?" When I was young, 6 to 8, not really sure, my parents had this apartment building they rent out near our house and one of the tenants were a couple. The wife's parents were also our neighbors and they lived a block away from us. I used to play with the wife's younger brother and would hang out at the couple's apartment to play. It was around the couple's son's birthday and I think it was his first because I remember they were making a big deal about it and talking about it for weeks. They were gonna hold it at the wife's parents' house which wasn't that far from home, so I asked my parents if I could go. I remember them indirectly saying no and I guess in a joking/teasing kind of way told me they were gonna serve ducks instead of chicken. I hated ducks as a kid. I remember clearly being really bummed out about it for days. A few days after the party, I was hanging out at the apartment and they were gushing about the party pictures that just got developed, film ones, and I was like, I wish I was there. Then the wife was like, "What do you mean? You were? Look, here you are." And showed me the pictures and I was there. I'm sure I'm not remembering it wrong because it has been bothering me all this time. I remember asking my aunt if I went and she even said no, but my friend, the younger brother, told me I was there and we even played. I just don't remember attending that party at all. I actually asked my aunt about this recently and she doesn't remember. It was just weird. Edit, spelling and details.
Thanks for watching. Please do like, share, comment and subscribe for more videos.